21 May 1945. Munich, Mullerstrasse. 8. A German civilian named Karl wrote a line in his notebook that could not be spoken in a stairwell, at a ration line, or at a work detail. If the rightful owner comes back, he will find me in his bed. He set down the pencil. He did not look up. The city around him was a geography of ash. The buildings were opened like books. The pages were the rooms. The sentences were cut off by daylight and silt. Windows were teeth. Courtyards were craters. The city had been educated in masonry. It now spoke in brick dust and bent iron. The arithmetic of survival began. Munich counted its missing and did not finish the tally. A city that had sent men east and south and into the air had lost them to prisons, forests, and clouds. The neighbors did not know which lists to read. A widow taped a notice to a door. Hans M. Feldpost 31845, last letter 38245, please report. The paper took on the texture of rain and ash. Occupation reports filed by American civil affairs teams describe the first weeks. Curfews on the wall. Disarmament at the door. Watches at the wrist fumbled into pockets. Boots lined up against stairwells. A Chevrolet with a white star and a radio antenna that points to a sky that is not taking messages. The voice on the radio says this street will not move after 9 p.m. The law is printed in English, German, and the grammar of raised hands. Karl walked to the ruins of the city office where he had filed housing forms in 1941. The door was open, but the lock was buried in plaster. A file drawer lay on its back. The labels read like a census of absence: Vermietung, Riemel, Beschwerden, tin tabs, copper clips, signatures. He reached for a folder familiar as a cousin's voice. He shook plaster off it like flour. Mullerstrasse, 8 Fam. B. 3 Zimmer, Bad Küche. His own address, his own address, his own name. The handwriting was his. He did not take it home. He wrote his line instead. The rubble work began because gravity had done its part and left. The women did what it had left undone. They lifted, they sorted, they stacked. A British occupation memo from Hamburg names them Trümmerfrauen, with a slash, a borrowed word that reads like an underlined gesture. Men were absent or in camps. Younger men moved under watch. Older men carried bricks side by side with women. But the shorthand remained: the women of rubble. The phrase did an honest part and an evasive one. It named the labor, not the loss. Karl watched them outside Mullerstrasse. 8. They had kerchiefs on their hair. They had shovels and stiff backs. They did not argue when an American sergeant pointed and said, "Nah." The curfew bell rang with the sound of a window frame hitting a sidewalk from 3 floors up. He wrote, "A wall weighs as much as a person." The food situation felt like a calculus problem with incorrect initial conditions. The inputs were grain shipments, potatoes from Brandenburg, Swedes from Schleswig-Holstein, loaves baked with more motivation than flour. The outputs were bodies that needed 2,400 calories, received 900, and burned memory to make up the balance. The mathematics of hunger was taught by turnips, by soups that were broth-colored stories, by a stomach that rehearsed history with a patience that looked like cruelty. A U.S. Army G5 Civil Affairs memo from July 1945 estimated daily rations in Munich at 1,050 calories on paper, 800 in practice. British reports from the Ruhr called it the hunger season. There would be a winter worse to come, the winter that would become proper noun and archive subject. Hunger Winter, 1946-47. Cigarettes became numbers. A lucky strike was a unit. 1 cigarette bought an egg. 3. Butter. 10. Sex. The arithmetic of desires in a ruined economy had the precision of a ledger and the shame of a secret. A monthly salary was less than a carton. Karl held a ration card and a cigarette his cousin had traded from a GI who needed his coat mended. The city hummed with a market that flourished in corners. Allied intelligence summaries called it the black market. The Germans called it the only market, with colors still on it. The Americans established military government law and marched in institutional sentences that had been translated into German legalese. Denazification would be a process. A process had categories. The Fragebogen, the questionnaire, arrived in piles. The numbers were an occupation feat. In the American zone alone, more than 13 million questionnaires passed across desks into hands through pencil tips that made the letter X into a moral instrument. Name, party membership, SA, SS, position, donations given, witnesses available, the fine print, false statements punishable by imprisonment. The Sprüchkammern, the tribunals, were set up in school buildings that had shelter signs painted on their stairs. The Nazi past would be processed in rooms with chalk dust and cracked linoleum. The categories had names that were as brittle as they were decisive. Hauptschuldig, major offenders, belastet offenders, minder belastet, lesser offenders, Mitlaufer followers, entlastet, exonerated. The mathematics of guilt would be performed in German by Germans under Allied direction, and then slowly, quietly, under German direction alone. Karl sat in a corridor with a form and a history. He had been a party member since 1937. He had joined because the head of his office had shifted the hiring board so that it was a door with a party badge for a handle. He had welcomed the work. He had filed the papers. He had accepted the extra allotment of sausage. He wrote down the dates. He wrote that he never wore a uniform, never held a weapon, never denounced a neighbor. He wrote that he had followed to keep his position. He gathered 2 Swabian Perselschein, notarized statements that washed him with the language of white laundry soap. Herr Karl M. was a decent man. He kept to himself. He was not political. He tried to help my husband get work. The neighbor did not mention that Karl had not gotten her husband work. The Sprüchkammer at the Alte Akademie heard his case on 10 October 1946. The panel included a jurist who had been removed in 1933 for political unreliability and reinstated in 1945 with the exhausted zeal of someone who knows that perfect justice is a stillborn child. It included a member of the SPD who had spent 1943 in Dachau and slept with the weight of that in his spine. It included a Catholic layman who had 3 children and no job until 6 weeks earlier. The hearing took 22 minutes. The verdict was Mitlaufer, a fine equal to 3-month salary, a ban on supervisory positions for 2 years. He could work as a clerk. The mathematics of guilt in Bavaria that year produced fewer Hauptschuldige than required to satisfy justice, more followers than could be processed, and an administrative fatigue that became policy. Occupation reports from 1947 recognized the slope of the moral curve. The Cold War was taking shape. The arithmetic of stability was taking precedence. The offices had to function. Policemen had to direct traffic. Teachers had to teach. Engineers had to rebuild bridges. The files were stamped. The doors reopened. In the meantime, the rooms of Germany, what was left of them, had bodies assigned like lots. The displaced arrived. The expellees arrived in columns and in railcars. They arrived from Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia, the Sudetenland. They had 1 suitcase each. The suitcase was a ledger with rope handles. It listed a chair that could not be carried, a field that could not be folded, a kitchen that could not be made into a parcel. They were Germans, and they were strangers. They were called refugees, and had to prove they were not part of an invading army. They were called Prussians in Bavaria, and answered to the name with a flinch. Bundesarchiv records put their number at between 12 and 14 million. The arithmetic of room assignment was brutal and intimate. Towns already loosened from their foundations by the bombings had to accommodate entire counties. A village of 800 took in 200. The bed Karl slept in became arithmetic. 4 persons per room, 2 families per kitchen. A stove serves 6 ration cards. The housing department was a front line without flags. Karl's job was to stamp, adjudicate, and endure the stare of the woman whose husband had not returned and wanted the extra meter of hallway for a cot. He marked a map with pins. Red pins for rooms with potential. Blue for rooms with potential. Blue for rooms with structural damage that could be repaired with salvage. He wrote, "Arithmetic of rooms, the numbers disagree with the walls." Newcomers and locals fought with their eyes first, then with their whispers, then with their fists. A man from Königsberg speaking a German with the Baltic's rolled consonants called the local butcher a thief. The butcher called him a beggar and asked to see his ration card and his wartime service. The war had ended and was still transacting in queues. A British civil affairs officer in Schleswig-Holstein wrote in an Allied intelligence summary, "In some municipalities, the hostility towards expellees has been greater than towards recently denazified former party members. The choice of the local 'we' is entirely pragmatic and understandable. The displaced had other names. DPs. Displaced had other names. DPs. Displaced persons. They were Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Balts, French, Dutch, Italians, men and women who had been dragged from their homes to work in German factories. They were left in the same camps, now labeled DP camps. The names were the name of the country and the name of the location. Bergen-Belsen was no longer a death camp. It was an administrative camp. Landsberg became a field of barracks, a small city of limbo. Fehrenwald grew a society of hope and trauma. Allied occupation reports speak in a tone like a cold hand on a warm forehead, fever present, eyes alert. In July 1945, a transport arrived at Fehrenwald DP camp. Among them was a Hungarian Jew named János Weiss, born in Nyíregyháza in 1919, deported to Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. Sent west on a late-war forced march that turned into a scattering of bones and boots on the roads of Bavaria. An Arolsen Archives case note from September 1946 records that János had been assigned in 1943 to a munitions plant near Dachau as forced labor. He had been housed in a barrack with a mattress stuffed with straw. He had paid for it with his back. On a cold morning in January 1946, he walked with a DP pass and a translated letter from a Jewish relief worker to an address in the city. He had been told that the barrack was gone, but that some of the camp guards had taken apartments in town and some of the factory workers had been resettled in requisitioned flats. He had heard a rumor that his name was still on a room assignment sheet, that perhaps the room had not been converted into someone else's forever. The address he carried was a building on the Schillerstrasse, not far from the Hauptbahnhof. The front door was still on its hinges. The apartment on the second floor had a door that was newly painted. He knocked. The woman who opened the door was wearing a sweater that had once been his wool blanket. He recognized a stitch he had made with a piece of wire on a night when it was too cold to sleep. He did not say that. He said in German, learned in the hard school of commands, "This is my room." She said, "No." He said, "I slept here before the end." The German he used said "before the end," the way Germans used it then, to name both the end of the regime and the end of a world. She said, "We have a paper." He held out his DP pass. The pass had an Allied stamp. Stamps were a variant of force in these months. She showed him a housing assignment from the city. The stamp was from an office where Karl worked. The math of the moment added one man to one door, one woman to one room, and arrived at an answer that was inadequate. Allied military police were called. A German policeman came with them. He looked at the papers, the Allied stamp and the city stamp. He looked at the man's coat. He looked at the woman's hallway. He had eyes that knew how to measure stairs with bad news. He said, "The apartment is occupied." Janos could not move her without the force that did not exist. The city did not have a category that fit his claim. He had lived in the building as a prisoner under guard and outside the law. The law had returned and put itself into proper categories. He was a man outside those categories with a body that prevented paperwork from becoming history. He signed a statement at the DP camp. Came to the house at Schillerstrasse 17. Someone else sleeping in the bed. He asked for a new mattress. The relief worker wrote in English, "We will find him one." The bed is a symbol and a need. Carl read the housing assignment log that afternoon and copied its numbers onto a sheet. The room in question was marked as assigned to a war widow with 2 children, 1 infant. He had placed her there in November after the first snow. He touched the file and found that it weighed what it always weighed, only as much as the paper, and more than he could lift. Occupation authorities forced Germans to confront what had happened. Some were made to walk through camps. Newsreels were shown in cinemas and not always watched. The Eisenhower order sent German civilians to bury the dead at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. An American officer's letter home, reprinted in an Allied intelligence summary, catches the tone of a local official compelled to dig. He said he did not know. He said he did not know. He said he did not have time to go to a camp while he was filling out ration cards. He held the shovel like a man holding a borrowed cane. Wir haben es nicht gewusst. We did not know. The sentence had a grammar that was flexible and a sound that was consistent. It could be whispered so that it sounded like an excuse. It could be shouted so it sounded like an accusation. It could be shouted so it sounded like an accusation, so that it looked like a currency. Allied reports noted an initial shock, then a settling into patterns of denial, displacement of guilt, and a focus on German suffering as a way of incorporating loss without entering the rooms where the victims lived or did not live. The DP camps were close. Buses passed them. The city lay between them and a future. Some Germans went to Fürstenwald with food and apologies. Many did not. A Jewish relief workers' report in 1947 describes a visit by 2 German women carrying potatoes. They stood in the doorway and did not enter. They said, "For the children." They did not look the mothers in the eyes. Karl took one trip to the camp. He went to settle a question about a house that had been requisitioned by the Americans and was scheduled for return to the city. The house had been used to quarter men from the camp for a week in January during a cold snap. The woman who owned it lived across town. She wanted it back with disinfectant and dignity. He had to sign a paper that said both were present or could be restored. He saw the fence. He saw the faces. He saw the children who were 3 and had no memory of any other bed than the one behind wire. He wrote in his notebook that night, "The bed I sleep in is not mine. It is a ledger entry. It has a footnote with a name in a language my mother does not know how to pronounce." The winter of 1946-47 taught arithmetic like a sermon teaches fear. The potatoes were frozen in the ground. The coal wagons came late or not at all. The ration was a decimal. The soup was counting. An elderly man named Otto K. in Karl's stairwell died in his chair. The cause of death on the certificate printed under Occupation Authority letterhead was heart failure. The coroner attached a note in pencil, and malnutrition. The black market moved indoors, then to cellars, then to the back rooms of bars where smoke sat so heavy that prices looked like apparitions in the air. A woman in Karl's building traded her wedding ring for 2 sacks of potatoes. a rumor moved across Munich that the Americans were stockpiling food for Germans they favored. The rumor was a lie that revealed an economy of envy and hunger that had always existed. The British zone had a different flow of coal and an older network of local administration. The Soviet zone had different arithmetic. Land was redistributed. Factories were dismantled. Denazification was swift and brutal where it was applied and selective where it was needed. Political reliability was a requirement that replaced the party card with the party line. In the West, economic policy was both a policy and a set of shipments. The Marshall Plan was a photograph of men in suits and a series of crates in ports. Bremen and Bremerhaven filled with barrels stamped with US letters. Flour, powdered milk, machine tools. A ledger entered the ports with each ship. The currency reform of June 1948 changed the arithmetic entirely. Reichsmarks became Deutsche Marks. People received 40 DM in an envelope. The food shops displayed goods the next morning because the arithmetic of hoarding and of moral hazard had shifted in a night. Cigarettes remained a currency for a while, but they now had competition. A bar of chocolate became a treat longer than a message. A woman fed her child cake in a cafe with a neon sign that had learned to glow again. The economy breezed in. Karl's job changed because the city changed, because the city changed. The rubble moved from the streets to the edges of town and formed hills that would later become parks. The housing crisis changed from an emergency of survival to a deficit within a growth curve. The city office that had handed out ration cards became an office that handed out building permits. His work moved from assigning rooms to issuing approvals for self-help housing and for small factories. A textile mill whose owner had returned from a British camp. A machine tools workshop whose owner had kept his membership passport but never bought the uniform. A bakery whose ovens were finally repaired. Occupation reports began to use the word normalization with a cautious pride. American officers in field grey caps over olive drab used German words in their English sentences and sometimes forgot they were doing it. The uniform lost its ability to make a sentence into a law at a distance of more than 10 meters. The Cold War arrived with a precision that was more logical than moral. The Berlin blockade of 1948 tested the arithmetic of logistics and put it into newspapers. The airlift turned the sky into a supply chain and the runway into an argument. The hum of C-47s over Berlin translated into the word freedom in headlines and into butter on bread in kitchens. The Americans and British dropped coal and candy. The Russians tightened their own math on the other side. Germans learned to place their moral answers inside their political geography. Karl watched the airlift on newsreel and counted his own numbers. 54 monthly ration units for fat, 70 for bread, 7 for sugar. The newsreel cut to a boy in Berlin catching a chocolate. His son asked when their town would have planes. The new democracy began as an improvisation on an Allied score, and then turned into legislation written by Germans elected in a style of election that had returned from exile. In 1949, the Basic Law was promulgated. Bonn became a capital with small shoulders and a large briefcase. The moral arithmetic of denazification adjusted. The American impatience with thoroughness had already made room for compromises that were then formalized as policy. The 131er Gesetz of 1951 re-employed civil servants from the previous regime. Judges sat on benches they had wiped clean with the sleeves of their coats. Teachers leaned into their classrooms with new textbooks and old habits. Karl was reclassified as an unencumbered civil servant and found himself in a supervisory position in 1952, 2 years earlier than the initial ban. The office needed men who knew where pipes were buried and where corridors had been widened without permits. The Spruchkammer files were moved to a basement that was less damp. The city operated with a layer of memory that was never properly cycled through. The mathematics of guilt turned into an assignment of chapters in textbooks. School children learned dates. They learned 1933. They learned 1939. They learned 1945. The years in between were taught as a set of causes in which necessity sat in the chair where agency should have sat, and as a set of outcomes in which German suffering took up many pages. The bombings were taught. The expulsions were taught. The famine was mentioned. The murdered were mentioned often but not named beyond the number and the category. Public commemorations grew plural and selective. The Volkstrauertag ceremonies resumed in churches that had lost stained glass and gained modesty. The speeches mentioned all victims of war, an expression that kept the grammar of responsibility out of the sentence. The expellee organizations filled stadiums and halls with banners that had lost the shape of eagles and kept the shape of grievance. They marched under the names of lost towns that had lost their Germans. The arithmetic of loss tallied a ledger in which all columns added up to tiers with no index of perpetrators. The Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, reparations from West Germany to Israel and to the Conference on Jewish Material Claims, became a debate with more heat than light. The Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, argued that compensation was a moral and political necessity. The Bundestag held its vote. Outside the chamber, protesters shouted that Germans were being made to pay for everything forever. The arithmetic of guilt was presented as a foreign calculation imposed on a country that needed to get on with the numbers of production. Karl read about it in the newspaper and did not speak about it at work. In his office, a man said that Israel was greedy. Another said the Americans were forcing it. A woman at the front desk said nothing. She stared at a photograph on her desk of a man who had not returned in 1946, then 1948, then never. She had stopped expecting. He thought of the man who had come to the Schillerstrasse. He had not seen him again. The Wirtschaftswunder appeared with the stealth of a vine. A plant in a window of an apartment on Karl Street had leaves again. Factories doubled their shifts. Men wore suits again. Women were not exhausted all the time. A washing machine company in Stuttgart put a new model in a shop window, and people stood and stared. Volkswagen became an American word in German mouths. The Federal Republic found a tone. Karl's job became numbers that smelled like progress, cubic meters of poured concrete, kilometers of pipe laid, permits processed, taxes collected. The office had a refrigerator in the break room. It hummed. The city listened to its hum instead of the hum of the planes that had bombed it. The new hum was a promise that bills could be paid and faced saved. But the arithmetic of rooms did not leave him. In 1954, a man from Hungary with a German transliteration of his name appeared in the office. It was Janos, now called Johann W. in the file, a paper correction with a condescension that called itself convenience. He had an address in Vienna now and a letter from the local Jewish community asking for assistance in the return of property lost during forced labor. The letter was written in the loyally German of Austrian empathy that had learned to survive and sound official. The property was not an apartment. It was a sewing machine and a box of books. He asked if the city had them in storage. He knew the answer. He asked anyway. People asked because asking was the only way to put a sentence into history, even when it had no predicate. Karl looked in the inventory of the factory liquidation. The sewing machine had been claimed by a woman from the factory administration in 1945. The box of books had been used as kindling. He wrote a letter that said the city had no record of the items. He added a sentence that the man could apply for compensation through the restitution office. He signed it with his full name. He put his title under it. He had the stamp. He used it. The stamp did its usual trick and turned a sentence into a wall. He went home and wrote in his notebook, "We improve, we forget, we make a good life, we make a good life, we are told to." The bed stays a ledger. The Cold War elided some questions while forcing others. The border hardened. The Berlin Wall would come later, cement in the shape of an era. In 1955, the Federal Republic regained sovereignty in the ways that mattered to jurists and soldiers. Bundeshauptstadt Bonn held receptions where men with histories stood under chandeliers and talked about the future. The East claimed anti-fascism as a national identity and had its own accounting of guilt. The West claimed democracy and markets and had its own accounting of amnesia. The expellees integrated, slowly. Their children spoke Bavarian in Bavaria and were called names less often. A man who had arrived with a sack now owned a store. His wife wore a dress that had been bought and not bartered. The organized politics of expellees negotiated with the government for pensions and recognition and built a lobby that could count. Karl processed applications for building permits for homes on the edge of the city that were built by men who would tell you where their families had come from only after they had told you about their potatoes. Denazification ended in file cabinets and in nostalgia. Men who had been major offenders quietly returned to desks in corporations. Their names appeared without footnotes on letterhead. A city planner who had designed the deportation schedule for the Jewish community in 1941 returned from a prison in 1950 and sat in a chair opposite Karl at a planning meeting in 1957. He had good ideas about traffic. He had a face that could talk about traffic and never mentioned trains that had not been trams. The school books that Karl's children brought home spoke of the Hitler regime with a syntax that made the subject abstract and the predicate distant. The teacher spoke of misuse of power. He spoke of propaganda. He spoke of the war. He did not name his own membership in the party. He did not mention that the teacher who had taught him had been Jewish and had been Jewish and had been Jewish and had been dismissed in 1933 and did not exist after 1942 except in a list that did not reach into the classroom. In 1960, the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem reached the newspapers. The man who had planned deportations with the accuracy of a timetable was now sitting in a glass booth telling judges how much habit can be made to sound like fate. The word responsibility acquired a history that could be reported and repeated in German living rooms. The television ran with it. Karl watched in the evening with his notebook open on his knee. He wrote, "He says he arranged train cars. I arranged rooms. Lawful does not mean moral. I kept the stamp." He thought again of the sentence he wrote in 1945. He wrote a new one. "We cannot leave the bed unmade and call it justice." In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up with a speed that hid deliberation. The arithmetic of the German question was replaced by masonry. East and West made peace with their compromises. Germans learned to live with the border. Inside Karl's head, the war that had ended in 1945 continued in a quiet way that made him careful with adjectives. The city displayed plaques for the bombings. It displayed memorials for the dead in foreign service. It placed a small, discreet plaque on a wall where Jews had once gathered, around the corner from a bakery. The plaque was in a tone that could not be accused of shouting. In 1963, Karl's son asked about the man they had never met, the Hungarian who had come to the door and asked for a bed. Karl told him the story in sentences without adjectives. He told him about paper. He told him about stamps. He told him about stamps. He told him about doors. The son's school had a teacher who brought in a new textbook. The photographs were clearer. The words were sharper. The gap between the bombings and the deportations narrowed by a paragraph. The teacher had not been a party member. He was 32. He told the class that the war had happened to their grandparents and through them. He said that the front line now was in their memory. He did not say paperwork. He did not say paperwork. He did not know what office desks could hold. In 1965, a letter from the restitution office arrived on Karl's desk as a courtesy copy. It detailed a payment to a man named Janos Johann W. in Vienna. The amount was modest. It was for the loss of a sewing machine and a box of books and a bed. The bed appeared in the category Household Effects. The letter used a number like 6475 DM for the bed. The letter fit into a folder. The folder fit into a cabinet. The cabinet fit into a room. The room fit into a city. The city fit into a country. The country fit into a history that still made requests in the margins. He walked home after reading it. He sat at the table. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had not lifted a rifle. They were the hands of a man who had carried files. He wrote, 21 May 1945. I wrote that if the rightful owner came back, he would find me in his bed. It is 20 years later. He did come back. He found a door with a lock that had my profession's hand on it. He found men who did not threaten him but did not open. He found a law that had categories and did not have him in it. He wrote again, the mathematics of guilt is not the mathematics of prisons alone. It is the arithmetic of stamps on an envelope, of rooms allocated to widows and not to those who had been made into numbers. It is the arithmetic of hunger that made thieves and of restitution that made numbers. It is the arithmetic of memory that subtracts until a sentence is left with a subject and no predicate. He put his notebook away. He went to work the next day. He signed 5 permits. He rejected 3. He had lunch with a colleague whose brother had died in 1944 and whose father had died in 1950 of something that was not listed as guilt. He walked past a plaque. He stood before it longer than his legs wanted to. In 1970, he watched on television as Willy Brandt knelt in Warsaw. He did not say anything. He thought that it had taken courage to kneel. He thought that he could have done it too in his way if kneeling had been a bureaucratic act. He thought about how kneeling would look at a city counter. He thought about mass and weight and what the knees know and the hands know. He thought about beds. He went home and opened his notebook one last time for that year. He wrote his opening line again with an addition that captured the years between, 21 May 1945. Munich. If the rightful owner came back, he would find me in his bed. 8 December 1970. He did. He found a door. He found paper. He found a man who had learned to call himself a Democrat and a father and a clerk. He found a stamp. He underlined the year. He closed the book. The city around him had grown into the skin of prosperity. Construction cranes looked like a vocabulary of optimism. The new City Hall annex had glass where the old had stone. The cafe on the corner had pastries that were almost obscene in their abundance. The fishmonger had Norwegian salmon. The butcher had 3 kinds of cured ham. The grocer had 3 kinds of cured ham. The grocer had oranges in winter. The hunger had receded into something like a story, and stories, he knew, could be told so that they warmed or so that they chilled. He tried to tell himself the right one and failed frequently. He lived long enough to see the files from the denazification tribunals go out of immediate use and into archive boxes with reference numbers. He lived long enough to see schoolchildren come to City Hall for tours and stand in front of a display of ration cards and ask if they were real. He lived long enough to hear a man on the radio say that the war had been an aberration and that Germans were now a normal people. He lived long enough to think that normality was a sentence that needed to be given less often. In his last entry about it, he wrote a sentence that belonged to a ledger and to a bedtime story and to an archive and to a plea. The war after the war was this: a bed, a door, a stamp, a man at a desk. What